Hey, so for all those that are following along, I'm going to pick up where I left off in chapter 11 of Hatchet, and got a crazy gurgle in my throat. um, so if you've been with me, if you've been listening, which there's like maybe 11 of you, but hey, 11's better than none. So um, you should know that Brian just found some eggs. This snapping turtle, I guess, laid them in the sand, sort of like a sea turtle does, and he just straight up ate them raw. So that just goes to show you just how hungry this character is, Brian is, and he's turning into a survivalist. If you remember, he's described himself as a city boy, and so now he's built a shelter, he's made fire using his hatchet, and you remember he tried the dollar bill, and the dollar bill didn't work, and then he shaved some of this birch bark, and he made fire with that. Finally, it took a long time. It wasn't just like done. I was going to today. I actually have a hatchet. Um, was going to try with a piece of flint to get some fire going, but unfortunately it started raining, so you can hear it, you can't see it because I got my background going on. But so Brian wouldn't have been able to make a fire in this situation. So maybe another time, maybe I'll test my survival skills. I know I haven't done a Lego update, so maybe I can get one of those going too. Anyways, so that's basically what's happened. He's had a dream. The dream gave him, it was of his dad, it was of Terry. It gave him some direction. He made a fire, and he found some eggs. So here's where we left off, chapter 11. There were things to do. He transferred all the eggs from the small beach into the shelter, reburying them near his sleeping area. It took all his will to keep from eating another one as he moved them, but he got it done. And when they were all out of sight, again, it was easier. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camp area. A good laugh that a good laugh that cleaning up the camping area. All he did was shake out his windbreaker and hang it in the sun to dry. The berry juice that had soaked in smoothed the sand, and he slept. Where he slept. Oh, gosh. Learn how to read. So he's laughing because he's saying cleaned up, but he really, I mean, he's not doing that much. But it was a mental thing. He had gotten depressed thinking about how they hadn't found him yet. And when he was busy and had something to do, the depression seemed to leave. So there were things to do. This is very important in survival. If you are ever like find yourself lost in the woods or something, or stuck on a desert island or something, they say the key is to keep yourself busy, so you don't like get depressed and slow down. You got to keep going. You got to keep doing. With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. He had decided to always have enough on hand for 3 days, and after spending one night with the fire for a friend, he knew what a staggering amount of wood it would take. He worked all through the morning at wood, breaking down dead limbs and breaking or chopping them into smaller pieces, storing them neatly beneath the overhang. He stopped once to take a drink at the lake, and in his reflection, he saw that the swelling on his head was nearly gone. If you haven't been with me, remember he bunked his head really bad when he landed the plane into the water. So he had like a really wicked like bump up on top of his head. So now it's almost gone, which shows you how much time has passed. Um, he stopped once to take a drink at the lake, and in his reflection, he saw the swelling on his head was nearly gone. There was no pain there, so he assumed that had taken care of itself. His leg was also back to normal, although he had small pattern of holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him while he was standing at the lake shore, taking stock. He noticed that his body was changing. He had never been fat. But he had been slightly heavy, with a little extra weight just above his belt at the sides. This was completely gone, and his stomach had caved in to the hunger, and the sun had cooked him past burning, so he was tanning. And with the smoke from the fire, his face was starting to look like leather. But perhaps more than his body was the change in his mind, or in the way that he was becoming. So this is a good little pause break. This shows you how a character can change based on what they're going through. So Brian is a city boy, and the city boy is changing because of his situation. He's crashed in Canada. He's having to learn how to survive. He's doing things that don't make him comfortable. And so it says he's noticing he's tanner, he's slimmer, and but the biggest thing, he's saying the biggest thing is the change in his mind, or the way he was becoming. Meaning he wasn't the Brian we met at the beginning. I'm not the same, he thought. I hear differently. He did not know when the change started, but it was there. When a sound came to him, now he didn't just hear it, but he would know the sound. He would swing and he'd look at it. A breaking twig, a movement of air, and know the sound as he somehow could move his mind back down the wave of sound to the source. He could know what the sound was before he quite realized he had heard it. And when he saw something, a bird moving, a wing inside a brush, or a ripple on the water, he would truly see the thing, not just notice it as he used to notice things in the city. He would see all the parts of it, see the whole wing, the feathers, see the color of the feathers, see the bush, see the size and shape of color of its leaves. He would see the way the light moved with the ripples of the water, and see that the wind made the ripples, and which way the wind had blown to make the ripples move that certain way. None of that used to be in Brian, and now it was part of him. A changed part of him, a grown part of him, and two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well, had made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound, his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without his thinking, he moved to face the sound or sight, moved to make ready for it, to deal with it. There were these things to do. When the wood was done, he decided to get a signal fire ready. He moved to the top of the rock ridge that comprised the bluff over his shelter, and was pleased to find a large flat stone area. So think about that for a second. Why would he want to get up high to create a signal fire? And so you got to imagine the setting that he's in. He's at a lake that's in the shape of an L. Okay, where's my camera? It's shape of an L. And then he's got like this little bluff. It's basically like this overhang of rock. It kind of creates like a cave, but a cave is actually where you go into the rock. This is just like almost like a C shape. And so inside is where he sleeps. He's created a front door, a lean-to, if you will. And then on top of it, it's this flat stone area. So I would imagine it's above the tree line. If you don't know what that means, above the tree line means it's either at or over the trees. So that's important, because if they're flying around looking for Brian, he's just one little kid in all these trees. So they have to have something that stands out to find him. So if he builds his fire up high on this flat rock above the trees, there's more of a likely they're going to see the smoke or see the fire. And if they see that, then they know that either something has happened, like some sort of bad weather. And if there's no bad weather, then that means there's a person there. Somebody made that fire. A bear didn't make it. Hopefully not. Bears can make fire. Dun, dun, dun. More wood, he thought, moaning inwardly. He went back to the fallen trees and found more dead limbs, carrying them up the rock until he had enough for a bonfire. Initially, he had thought of making a signal fire every day, but he couldn't. He would never be able to keep the wood supply going. So while he was working, he decided to have the fire ready, and if he heard an engine, or even thought he heard of a plane engine, he would run up with a burning limb and set the signal fire. Things to do. At the last trip to the top of the stone bluff with the wood, he stopped, sat on the point overlooked the lake, and rested. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he had not seen it this way since he had come in with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear, a breath-tightening little rip of terror. But it passed, and he was quickly caught up in the beauty of the scenery. It was incredibly beautiful, that it was almost unreal. From his height, he could see not just the lake, but across part of the forest, a green carpet, and it was full of life, birds, insects. There was a constant hum and a song. And at the other end of the bottom of the L, there was a large rock sticking out over the water, and on top of the rock, a snaggly pine had somehow found food and grown, bent and gnarled. Sitting on one limb was a bluebird with a chest and sharp beak and a kingfisher. He thought of a picture he had once seen, which left the branch while he watched and dove into the water. It emerged a split second later, its mouth full of small fish, wiggling silver in the sun. It took the fish to a limb, juggled it twice, and swallowed it whole. Fish. So, one thing about Brian that I've noticed, I've read this book, I want to say 6 times, and maybe more. I don't know. It feels like 6, but maybe more. So one thing about Brian that really impressed me is for his age, he's very exposed. Like early on in the book, it talked about that he knew something about planes and how planes flew, wings and thrust, and it also talks about like him knowing different types of berries, different types of animals, things he watched. So all these things, he was a city boy, but all these things has helped him. And here's another thing. He thinks of a picture. So he's read a lot of nonfiction books in his life, and he's able to look and identify a bird. I don't know if I could identify a kingfisher bird just by sight. So that shows that Brian, a 13-year-old, is smarter than me in regards to his animal knowledge. So gotta step your game up, Mr. Meadows. Fish. Of course, he thought. There were fish in the lake, and there were food, and if a bird could do it. He scrambled down the side of the bluff and trotted to the edge of the lake, looking down into the water. Somehow, it had never occurred to him to look inside the water, only the surface. The sun was flashing back up into his eyes, and he moved off to the side and took his shoes off and waded out 15 feet. Then he turned and he stood with the sun to his back, and he studied the water again. It was, he saw after a moment, literally packed with fish. Small fish swam everywhere, some narrow and some long, some round, most of them 3 or 4 inches long, some a bit larger, some a bit smaller. There was a patch of mud off to the side, leading into deeper water, and he could see old clam shells. Old clam shells there. So there must be clams. As he watched, a crawfish, looking like a tiny lobster, left one of the empty clams shells and went to another looking for something to eat, digging with his claws. While he stood, some of the small round fish came quite close to his legs, and he tensed, got ready and made a wild stab at grabbing one of them. They exploded away into 100 flicks of quick light, so fast that he had no hope of catching them that way. But they soon came back, seemed to be curious about him, and as he walked from water, he tried to think of a way to use the curiosity to catch them. He had no hooks, no strings, but if he could somehow lure them into the holes and make a spear, a small fish spear, he might be able to strike fast enough to get one. He would have to find the right kind of food, or the right kind of wood. Hopefully, he ain't eating wood yet. I'm starving. Eat some. Okay. The right kind of wood, slim and straight. He had seen some willows up along the lake that might work, and he could use the hatchet to sharpen and shape it while he was sitting by the fire. And that brought up the fire, which he had to feed again. He looked at the sun and saw it was getting late in the afternoon. And when he thought of how late it was, he thought that he ought to reward all the hard work with another egg, and made him think that some kind of dessert would be nice. He smiled when he thought of dessert. So fancy. And he wondered if he should move up the lake and see if he could find some raspberries. After he banked the fire, and while he was looking for the right wood for a spear wood, he thought, and it rolled together, just rolled together and rolled over him. There were things to do. So this chapter is pretty important. He gets the signal fire made. He sets a goal for himself to always have 3 days worth of wood, and now he's got a new goal. Gotta catch some fish. I'm hungry. So that's going to be our focus, I'm sure, for the next one. The fish spear didn't work. Chapter 12. He stood in the shallows and waited again and again. The small fish came closer and closer, and he lunged time and time again, but he always was too slow. He tried throwing it, jabbing it, everything but flailing with it, and it didn't work. The fish was just too fast. He had been so sure, so absolutely certain that it would work the night before. Sitting by the fire, he had taken the willow and carefully peeled the bark until he had a straight staff, about 6 feet long and just under an inch thick at the base, the thickest end. Then, propping the hatchet in a crack in the wall, he had pulled the head of the spear against it, carving a thin piece off each time until the thick end tapered down to a needle point. Still not satisfied, he could not imagine hitting one of the fish with a single point. He carefully used the hatchet to split the point up in the middle for 8 or 10 inches and jammed a piece of wood up into a split to make 2-pronged spear, with the points about 2 inches apart. It was crude, but it looked effective and seemed to have good balance. When he stood outside the shelter and heft the spear, he had worked on the fish spear until it had become more than just a tool. He'd spent hours and hours on it, and now it didn't work. He moved into the shallows and stood, and the fish came to him just before they swam around his legs, some of them almost 6 inches long, but no matter how he tried, they were too fast. At first, he tried throwing it, but that had no chance. As soon as he brought his arm back, well before he threw, the movement frightened them. Next, he tried lunging at them, heaving the spear ready just above the water and thrusting it. Finally, he actually put the spear in the water and waited until the fish were right in front of it. But still, somehow, he telegraphed his motion before he thrust, and they saw it and flashed away. He needed something to spring the spear forward, some way to make it move faster than the fish. Some motive force, a string that snapped, or a bow and arrow, a thin, long arrow with a point in the water, and the bow pulled back so that all he had to do was release the arrow. Yes, that was it. He had to invent the bow and arrow. He almost laughed as he moved out of the water and put his shoes on. The morning sun was getting hot, and he took his shirt off. Maybe that was how it really happened. Way back when, some primitive man tried to spear fish, and it didn't work. And he invented the bow and arrow. Maybe it was always that way. Discoveries happen because they needed to happen. He had not eaten anything yet this morning, so he took a moment to dig up the eggs and eat one. Then he reburied them, banked the fire with a couple of thicker pieces of wood, settled the hatchet on his belt, took the spear in his right hand, and set off to the lake to find wood to make a bow. So think about how Brian has changed as a character. I mean, everything he does now, it's so like intentional. Like, I got to bank the fire. Banking the fire means he puts wood in it. Okay. I got to grab my spear. I got to get my hatchet. It's on my belt. I mean, it's just very like he's got a process to it. And whereas when we started, he was very like accident prone and like always making mistakes in the situation. So he's really changing each time. And sometimes you can miss little things like that if you don't pay attention to how the character acts. He went without a shirt, but something about the smoke smell on him kept the insects from bothering him. As he walked to the berry patch, the raspberries were starting to become overripe. Just in 2 days, and he would have to pick as many possible after he found the wood. But he didn't take a little time now to pick a few and eat them. So what he's saying is, these berries are about to go bad. He's got to pick as many as he can because they're about to be out of here. So his raspberry, it's a good thing he's trying to figure out this fishing thing because his raspberry supply is about to be cut off. They were full and sweet, and when he picked one, 2 others would fall off the limbs into the grass, and soon his hands and cheeks were covered with red berry juice, and he was full. That surprised him, being full. He hadn't thought he would ever be full again. Knew only the hunger, and here he was, full. 1 turtle egg and a few handfuls of berry, and he felt full. He looked down at his stomach and saw that it was still caved in, did not bulge out as it would have with 2 hamburgers and a freezy slush. It must have shrunk, and there was still hunger there, but not like it was, not tearing at him. This was hunger that he knew would be there always, even when he had food, a hunger that made him look for things, see things, a hunger to make him hunt. He swung his eyes across the berries to make sure the bear wasn't there, and at his back. Then he moved down to the lake. The spear went out before him automatically, moving the brush away from his face as he walked. And when he came to the water's edge, he swung left, not sure what he was looking for, not knowing what wood might be best for a bow. He had never made a bow, never shot a bow in his life, but it seemed that it would be along the lake near the water. He saw some young birch, and they were springy, but they lacked snap somehow, as did the willows. So not enough whip back. Halfway up the lake, just as he started to step over a log, he was absolutely terrified by an explosion under his feet. Something like a feather bomb blew up and away in a flurry of leaves and thunder. It frightened him so badly that he fell back, down, and then it was gone, leaving only an image in his mind, a bird. It had been about the size of a very small chicken, only with a fantail and stubby wings, that slammed against his body and made loud noises. Noises there and gone. He'd gone up and brushed himself off. The bird had been speckled, brown and gray, and it must not be very smart because Brian's foot had been nearly on it before it flew. Half a second more, and he would have stepped on it. So he's walking, and he almost steps on this bird that's on the ground. It's right in front of him. I mean, if he would have seen it, he could have got it with a spear. So that tells me that this bird is blending in very well. And it caught it, he thought, and eaten it. He might be able to catch one with a spear. Just said that. Or spear one. Maybe he thought maybe it tasted like chicken. Maybe he could catch one or spear one, and it probably did taste just like chicken. Just like chicken when his mother baked it in the oven with garlic salt and turned it golden brown and it crackled. He shook his head to drive the picture out and move down the shore. There was a tree there with long branches that seemed straight, and when he pulled on one of them and let it go, it had an almost vicious snap to it. He picked one of the limbs that seemed right and began chopping where the limb joined the tree. The wood was hard, and he didn't want to cause it to split. So he took his time, took small chips, and concentrated. So hard that at first he didn't hear it. A persistent whine, like the insects, only more steady, with the edge of a roar to it, was in his ears, and he chopped and cut and was thinking of a bow, how he would make a bow, how it would be when he shaped it with his hatchet. And still, the sound did not cut through until the limb was nearly off the tree, and the whine was inside his head, and he knew it. A plane. Womp womp. So Brian is so in the middle of chopping this wood and making his bow. His mind is thinking about the bow, and he's thinking about chopping, and so he misses an opportunity. Remember, when the plane is there, he's gotten so busy. His mind is so focused that that now he's ignoring his environment, and so now a plane. Womp womp. A plane, it was a motor far off, but seeming to get louder. They are coming for him. He threw down the limb and his spear, and holding the hatchet, he started to run for camp. Notice, he keeps the hatchet. Everything else he drops, because the hatchet is his only tool. It's almost another character in the book. The hatchet's pretty important. Hatchet. It's on the cover. It's the name of the book. He started to run for the camp. He had to get the fire up on the bluff and signal them, get the fire and the smoke up. He put all of his life into his legs, jumped logs, moved through brush like a light ghost, swiveling and running his lungs, filling and blowing, and now the sound was louder and coming his direction. It was right at him, at least closer. He could see it all in his mind now, the picture, the way it would be. He would get the fire going. The plane would see the smoke, circle once, circle twice, then again, and wag its wings. It would be a float plane, and it would land on the water and would come across the lake, and the pilot would be amazed that he was alive after all these days. All this he saw as he ran for the camp and the fire. They would take him from here, and this very night, he would sit with his father, and he would eat and tell him all the things. He could see it now. Oh, yes, all as he ran in the sun, his legs liquid springs. He got to the camp, still hearing the whine of the engine, and one stick of wood still had good flame. He dove inside and grabbed the wood and ran around the edge the ridge, scrambling up like a cat, and blew and nearly had the flame feeding growing when the sound moved away. It was abrupt, as if the plane had turned. He shielded the sun from his eyes, and he tried to see it, tried to make the plane become real in his eyes. But the trees were high, so thick, and now the sound was even fainter. He kneeled again to the flames, and he blew, and added grass and chips, and the flames fed and grew, and in moments he had a bonfire as high as his head, but the sound was gone now. Look back, he thought. Look back and see the smoke. Now turn, please, turn. Look back, he whispered, feeling all the pictures fade, seemingly his father's face fade, like the sound, like the lost dreams, like an end to hope. Oh, turn now and come back. Look back and see the smoke and turn for me. But it kept moving away until he could not hear it even in his imagination, in his soul. It was gone. Ooh, ooh. That's sad. He stood on the bluff over the lake, his face cooking in the roaring bonfire, watching the clouds and ash smoke going into the sky, and he thought, no more than thought. He knew then that he would not get out of this place. Not now, not ever. So this moment, this sad moment, he hears a plane, he's like booking it back to camp, he gets the fire going, and then the plane has already turned and started flying away. If you remember, Brian determined that he had to be way off course because he had been flying when the pilot had a heart attack. He jerked the plane off course, and so this plane probably flew really far out off course. And once it just got to a certain distance and didn't see anything, it decided to turn back. And so now Brian has a moment of, I'm never getting out of here. This is it. That had been a search plane. He was sure of it. That must have been them, and they had come as far off to the side of the flight plan as they thought they would have to come, and then they turned back. They did not see the smoke. They did not hear the cry from his mind. They would return. He would never leave now, never get out of here. He went down to his knees and felt the tears start, cutting through the smoke and the ash on his face, slightly falling onto the stone. Gone. He thought finally, it was all gone, all silly and gone. No bows, no spears or fish or berries. It was all silly anyway. All just a game. He could do a day, but not forever. He could not make it if they did not come for him someday. He could not play the game without hope, could not play the game without a dream. They had taken it all away from him now. They had turned away from him, and there was nothing for him now. The plane was gone, his family was gone, all is gone. They would not come. He was alone, and there was nothing for him. This is a really sad moment for Brian. I mean, it's like he just gives up hope. He says, I'm playing a game here. I could do it for a little while, but I can't do it forever. I can't live out here. And now I'm all alone, and now I'm done. Let me see how long chapter 13 is. I feel like this video is forever. Okay. Chapter 13. Brian stood at the end of a long part of the L of the lake and watched the water, smelled the water, listened to the water, was the water. Fish moved, and his eyes jerked sideways to see the ripples, but he did not move any other part of his body and did not raise the bow or reach into his belt pouch for a fish arrow. It was not the right kind of fish, not a food fish. The food fish stayed close in the shallows and did not roll the way rolled that way, but made quicker movements, food movements. The large fish rolled and stayed deep and could not be taken. But it didn't matter. This day, this morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was the light meat. He was sick of them. He was looking for one of the fool's birds. He called them fool's birds. And there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake. But something he did not understand had stopped him, and he stood beneath gently through his mouth to keep sight, letting his eyes and ears go out and do the work for him. So something you might have missed while I was reading is evidently some time has passed since the plane has come through, because it said this day, this morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was the light meat. He was sick of them. When it says he's sick of them, that tells me that he has caught them. So he is evidently, days have passed. He's done something where he's caught some fish because he's tired of eating it. So sometimes authors and books, they don't make it aware. You have to determine that as the reader. So he didn't want to spend another, Gary Paulson didn't want to spend another chapter talking about him making a bow and him figuring out how to fish. He might do that with some sort of background or anything. But he just gives you one little line in the book to tell you as the reader, some time has passed. And now Brian has already caught fish, and now Brian is trying to catch something else. He's trying to get these birds. So he was looking for the fool's birds. He called them fool's birds, and there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake. But something he did not understand had stopped him, and he stood breathing gently through his mouth to keep silent, letting his eyes and ears go out and do the work for him. It had happened before this way. Something had come into him from outside to warn him, and he had stopped. Once it had been the bear again. He had been taking the last of the raspberries, and something came inside and stopped him. And when he looked where his ears said to look, there was a female bear with cubs. Uh-oh. So here's a flashback. So Brian has already gotten all the berries. He's already been hunting fish. He's seen the bear again. So the author has given us a lot of information, and it's only been 3 paragraphs. So sometimes you really got to pay attention. Had he taken 2 more steps, he would have come between the mother and her cubs, and that was a bad place to be. As it was, the mother had stood and faced him and made a sound, a low sound in her throat, and threatened and warned him. He paid attention to the feeling now, and he stood and he waited patiently, knowing he was right and that something would come. Turn, smell, listen, feel, and the sound, a small sound. And then he looked up and away from the lake, and he saw the wolf. It was halfway up the hill from the lake, standing with its head, shoulders sticking out into a small opening, looking down on him with yellow eyes. He had never seen a wolf, and the size threw him. Not as big as a bear, but somehow seemingly that large. The wolf claimed all that was below him as his own, took Brian as his own. So this is, he's seen a bear. That's scary. He's seen, now he's seen a wolf. And the thing we know about wolves are, bears are typically, they hunt alone. But wolves hunt in packs. So if you see one, that's probably the alpha wolf or a scout or something. And then there's always more. So that's pretty scary. And a wolf, you see my German Shepherds, they're pretty big dogs. Wolves are bigger than that, thicker, muscular, fast, sharp teeth. Brian looked back and for a moment felt afraid because the wolf was so right. He knew Brian. He knew him. He owned him. He chose not to do anything to him. But the fear moved away. And Brian knew the wolf for what it was, another part of the woods, another part of all of it. Brian relaxed the tension on the spear in his hand. He settled the bow in his other hand. See, he's already made the bow. in his other hand. Now I've lost my place, and I don't. As part of the woods, another part of it all. Brian relaxed the tension on the spear in his hand, settled the bow in his other hand from where it had started to come up. He knew the wolf now, as the wolf knew him, and he nodded to it. He nodded and he smiled. The wolf watched him for another time, another part of his life. Then it turned and walked effortlessly up the hill, and as if it came out of the brush, it was followed by 3 other wolves. Pack, just saying. And all equally large and gray and beautiful, all looking down on him as they trotted past and away, and Brian nodded to each of them. He was not the same now. The Brian that stood and watched the wolves moved away and nodded to them was completely changed. Time had come, time that had measured but didn't care about. Time had come into his life and moved out and left him differently. It measured time. 47 days had passed since the crash. So 47 days. A month is typically 30 to 31 days. So he's been there more than a month. 42 days, he thought, since he had died and been born as the new Brian. So when it says he had died, he's talking about his character, who he was. Brian didn't actually die, and then he came back. He's saying, I died. The Brian that you knew at the beginning of the book, chapter 1, he's gone. He fell in the water with the plane. The Brian that came out, the survivor Brian, this is a different kid. When the plane had come and gone, it had put him down, gutted him, and dropped him and left him with nothing. The rest of that first day, he had gone down and down until dark. He had let the fire go out. He had forgotten to eat even an egg, had let the brain take him down to where he was done, where he wanted to be done and done. So what that means is he got depressed, let the fire go out, forgot to eat the eggs. He was just like, whatever. To where he wanted to die. He had settled into the gray funk deeper and still deeper until finally, in the dark, he had gotten up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. So this is pretty sad. Brian wants to kill himself after the plane. He's so depressed, like it's all over. Madness, a hissing madness that took his brain. There had been nothing for him then, and he tried to become nothing, but the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do. And he had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end, and slept, only didn't sleep. With his eyes closed and his mind open, he lay on the rock through the night, lay and hated and wished for it all to end, and he thought the words, cloud down through the awful night. Over and over the word, wanting all his clouds to come down, but in the morning he was still there on his side, and the sun came up. When he opened his eyes, he saw the cuts on his arm, the dry blood turning black. He saw the blood, and he hated the blood. He hated that he had done this to himself when he was the old Brian and he was weak. And 2 things came into his mind, 2 true things. So these are, the author is saying, these are 2 true things that Brian has learned. So they're probably very important for us to know. So 2 things. He was not the same. The plane passing changed him. The disappointment cut him down and made him new. He was not the same and would never be again like he had been. That was one of the true things, the new things. And the other one was that he would not die. He would not let death end again. So the 2 things are, 1, I'm not the same. 2, I'm not going to be this way again. I'm not going to be depressed and do this again. Here comes Gideon. He just snuck out the front door. What are you doing? I'm reading a book, Bubbles. Bubbles? Of course, he had made a lot of mistakes. He smiled now, walking up the lake shore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes, the mistakes that had came before he realized that he had to find new ways to be what he had become. He had made new fire, which he now kept going using partially rotten wood because of the punky wood would smolder for many hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right now for a while. His first bow was a disaster that almost blinded him. He had sat, so here comes a flashback to explain how Brian made his bow, which the author feels like is important information for us to go back over. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs carefully until the bow looked beautiful. Then he had spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were hollow, straight, and then with the bark peeled, and he fired hardened points and split a couple of them to make fork points. And he had done, as he had done with the spear. So he's got his Hawkeye arrows going on. So he's made some split points and he's hardened them in the fire. He had no feathers, so he just left them bare, figuring for fish, he only had to travel a few inches. The feather helps balance the arrow in the air. He had no string, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had long laces, too long, and he found that one lace cut in half could take care of both shoes, and that left the other lace for a bowstring. All right, I got like 2 more pages. I don't know how long I've been reading. It feels like this video is going to be another long one. All seemed to be going well until he tried a test shot. He put an arrow in the string, put it back to his cheek, pointed it at the dirt hamlock, and at that pierced instant, the bow wood exploded in his hands, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. 2 pieces actually struck his forehead just above his eyes, and had they been only slightly lower, they would have blinded him. 2 stiff mistakes. In his mental journal, he listed them to tell his father, listed all the mistakes he had made a new bow with slender limbs and a more fluid, gentle pull, but could not hit the fish, though he had sat in the water and was in the end surrounded by a virtual cloud of small fish. It was infuriating. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more than just an inch away, release the arrow, only to miss. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish again and again, but the fish did not get hurt. Finally, after hours, he stuck an arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for the fish to come close. And while he was waiting, he noticed that the water seemed to make the arrow bend and break in the middle. This is what we talked about in science. Remember, refraction. So he's seeing the fish in one spot, but the water refracts the light, and the fish is actually somewhere else. Of course, he had forgotten the water refracts. It bends light. He had learned that somewhere in class, Mr. Benner's class maybe. It was biology. He could not remember, but it did bend the light, and that meant the fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim just under them. He would not forget his first hit, not ever. A round, shaped fish with golden sides as gold as the sun, stopped in front of the arrow, and he aimed just beneath it. At the bottom edge of the fish, and released the arrow. And there was a bright flurry, a flash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow, he raised it up, and the fish was on the end, wiggling against the blue light. He held the fish against the sky until it stopped wiggling, held it, looked to the sky, and felt his throat tighten, swell, and fill with pride at what he had done. He had done food. With the bow, with an arrow fashioned by his own hands, he had done food. He found a way to live. The bow had given him the way and exalted in it. In the bow, the arrow, the fish, the hatchet in the sky. He stood, he walked from the water, he's still holding the fish and the arrow and the bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms, as they were part of him. He had food. He cut a green willow fork. He held the fish over the fire until the skin crackled and peeled away, and the meat inside was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth and his tongue to get the juices out of them. Hot, steaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought then, ever get enough. And all that first new day, he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooking it, and eating it, a fish buffet. Taking it back to the fire, cooking it, eating it, then back to the lake, shooting a fish, cooking it, eating it, and on the way until it was dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water with the thought that they might work as bait. Smart man, Brian. And the other fish would come by the hundreds to clean them. He could take his pick of them like a store, he thought, just like a store. And he could not remember later how many he ate that day, but he thought it might have been over 20. It had been a feast day, his first feast day, celebration of being alive, and the new way he had of getting food. By the end of the day, when it became dark, and he laid next to the fire with his stomach full of fish and grease from the meat smeared around his mouth, he could feel new hope building in him. Not hope that he would be rescued, that was gone, but hope in the knowledge, hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope. He thought that night, I'm full of tough hope. So this is a pretty big chapter 13. If you can hear me over my son, who has decided he's going to be a whiner, and now he looks like a demon ghost. Chapter 13, we see a flashback. He's met several different animal characters. Now I'm like a ghost. He's met several characters, some wolves. He's seen another bear. He's looked at these fool's birds. He's wanted to die. He tried to kill himself. Now he's figured out that he's different. He's no longer the Brian that we met early on, and he wants to live. He wants to survive. He's a fisherman. So this is a pretty big chapter. So hopefully you gotten a lot out of it, especially that last part. But hope in the knowledge, hope in the fact that he could learn and he could survive and he could take care of himself. Tough hope. So he no longer believes he's going to be rescued. He only believes that he can survive now. He can live. All right, guys. Creepy Ghost Man out. I'll be posting a quiz. Check it out. Thanks.